I was standing at my kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, completely ordinary coffee still brewing, when an envelope arrived that would show me in the coldest and most precise way possible exactly how much my own family believed my future was worth. $38,000. Borrowed in my name. Signed with my signature. And spent on a wedding I attended as a guest dressed in a bridesmaid gown, smiling in photographs, completely unaware that somewhere in a filing cabinet I had never seen my entire financial life had already been quietly handed over. The people who did it were not strangers. They were not criminals in the way we picture criminals. They were the two people who taught me how to tie my shoes, who sat beside my bed when I was sick, who told me, more times than I can count, that family protects its own. What they never told me was which members of the family that protection was actually designed for. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I would love to know where in the world you are watching from. My is real. There are moments in life when the people you love most become the ones who wound you deepest. Not with cruelty, but with assumption. With the quiet, devastating belief that your loyalty is unlimited, your silence is guaranteed, and your name is theirs to borrow. And my sister's wedding was beautiful. I know because I paid for a significant portion of it, just not willingly and not with my knowledge. And the day I received the collections notice for nearly $38,000, I sat in my car for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just read the number over and over, the way you read something in a foreign language hoping it will eventually make sense. It didn't. And my parents had taken out a loan in my name. They had signed my signature on the paperwork. They had listed my address. And when the bills began arriving, the florist, the venue, the catering, the dress alterations, they went to a P.O. box my mother had quietly opened months before the wedding. And when I finally sat across from them at the kitchen table where I had grown up doing homework and eating Sunday dinners, my mother looked at me the way she always had when she wanted me to understand something without her having to say it. She said they had no choice. She said I was the stable one. She said my sister deserved the wedding she had always dreamed of. And I asked her what I deserved. And the silence in that room was louder than anything I have ever heard. And I want to be clear about something. I did not do what I did out of rage. I did it out of grief. Because the person who commits fraud against you is one thing. The person who raised you committing that fraud is something else entirely, something that doesn't have a clean name or a simple emotion attached to it. And I filed a police report. I contacted the lender. I cooperated fully with every investigation that followed. I did not soften my statement. I did not call to check on them afterward. I did not absorb the consequence so that they wouldn't have to feel it. And my sister called me once from what I assumed was her honeymoon. She said I was tearing the family apart. I told her that the family had already made its choices about what things were worth tearing apart. And people who hear this story often ask me if I regret it. They mean the report. They mean refusing to quietly take on the debt and move on. They mean choosing my name and my credit and my dignity over the performance of family harmony. And I understand why they ask. It is genuinely difficult to watch your parents face consequences. It is difficult in a way that never fully leaves you. But I also know what it felt like to open that envelope. To realize that somewhere in their calculations my entire financial future had simply been weighed and found expendable. And that realization, that quiet clinical act of being deemed expendable, does something to a person that is very hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it. It is not just the money. People often reduce it to the money because the money is concrete and countable and gives everyone something measurable to argue about. But the money was never really the point. The point was what the decision revealed. The point was the meeting that must have taken place, the conversation between my parents where my name came up and someone said yes and no one in that room said no, and I kept trying to reconstruct it in my mind. I kept trying to imagine the exact moment when they moved from desperation to action, when the idea went from unthinkable to signed and submitted. I don't know if that moment came easily or if they wrestled with it. What I do know is that they never told me. Not before. Not during. Not in the months that the bills were quietly rerouted away from me. They looked at me across holidays and phone calls and ordinary Tuesdays, and they said nothing. And that is the part that settled in me like something cold. And my sister never fully acknowledged what had been done. Even in the conversations that came later after lawyers were involved and the weight of everything had become impossible to ignore, she spoke about it in a language carefully designed to distribute the guilt so thinly that no one person could be held responsible. She used words like situation and miscommunication and difficult time. She never used the word fraud. She never said my name alongside an apology. And I had always been the dependable one. Growing up, that was the word used for me the way other families use words like creative or adventurous or funny. Dependable. I had believed for most of my life that this was a compliment. That being the person others could count on was a form of love, a way of mattering. It took this to show me what dependable had actually meant to them. It meant available. It meant usable. It meant that when a problem needed solving and a resource needed tapping, my stability was not something they admired, it was something they had simply learned to spend. And there is a specific loneliness in being betrayed by people who genuinely believe they have not betrayed you. My parents were not cold people. They were not calculating in the way that word implies, darkness of character. They were people who loved their children and had simply catastrophically decided that one child's future was a reasonable price for another child's wedding day. And because they loved the daughter whose wedding it was, and because they believed I was strong enough to survive it, they found a way to make peace with what they had done before I even knew it had happened. And that is perhaps the most disorienting part of all of it. By the time I found out, they had already forgiven themselves. I was the only one still standing at the beginning of something they had long since moved past. And there are people who told me I should have handled it privately. That families absorb these things. That the legal system is a blunt instrument and love deserves a more careful tool. I heard those arguments. I understood them. I even felt their pull on certain nights when the weight of everything made the easier path look almost reasonable. But I knew something those people did not, or perhaps something they knew but were asking me to forget. I knew that absorbing it quietly would not have been forgiveness. It would have been confirmation. It would have told everyone in that family that my name, my credit, my future could be borrowed without asking and returned without apology, and that the only consequence would be my continued silence. I was not willing to be that lesson. And so I let the process move forward. I answered every question asked of me honestly. I provided every document requested. I did not call my mother on her birthday that year. I did not send a card. I sat with the discomfort of that, with the way it felt to choose myself over the rituals of family, and I did not pretend it was easy or clean or without grief. And because it was full of grief. It was one of the most grief-filled periods of my life, not because of what I had done but because of what had been done to me, and because of what I was slowly, irreversibly understanding about the people I had trusted most without ever thinking to examine that trust. There is a version of this story where I am the villain. I know that version exists because I have heard it told. It circulates through extended family the way these things do, softened at the edges, rearranged slightly with certain details quietly removed and others gently amplified. In that version I overreacted. In that version my parents made a mistake born of desperation, and I responded with a severity that no loving child should have visited upon the people who raised them. In that version the wedding was beautiful and the family was struggling, and I had the means to help, and instead I chose punishment over compassion. And I used to feel the need to correct that version when I encountered it. I no longer do. And what I understand now that I did not understand in those first raw months is that the story people choose to believe about a situation like this reveals far more about them than it does about the situation itself. The relatives who sided with my parents were not siding with the truth. They were siding with their own comfort. Because if my parents were wrong, genuinely legally indefensibly wrong, then every assumption those relatives held about family loyalty and parental love and the quiet sacrifices children are expected to make had to be examined. And that examination is uncomfortable. It is far easier to decide that I was cold, that I was rigid, that I lacked the generosity of spirit that the moment required. And I became the cautionary tale in a story that I had not written and had not chosen. And my relationship with money changed after this. Not in the ways people might expect. I did not become reckless with it, nor did I become obsessive. What changed was something quieter and more fundamental. I stopped believing that financial security was something that could simply be maintained through discipline and responsibility. Because I had been disciplined. I had been responsible. I had spent years building something careful and stable, and it had been taken from me in a transaction I never participated in by people who knew exactly what they were taking and took it anyway. The vulnerability of that understanding never fully left me. And I think about the version of myself that existed before that collections notice arrived. She was someone who believed without ever consciously choosing to believe it that the people who love you would not destroy you. Not deliberately. Not with paperwork and forged signatures and rerouted mail. She was someone who thought that being trusted and being safe were the same thing. I think about her with a great deal of tenderness and also with a sorrow I cannot entirely name. And because she was not naive. That is the thing I most want people to understand. She was not someone who ignored warning signs or refused to see complexity in the people around her. She was simply someone who had not yet been shown the specific shape that betrayal can take when it comes dressed in the clothing of family necessity and parental desperation. She had not yet learned that love and harm are not mutually exclusive, that someone can genuinely love you and still look at everything you have built and decide that their need is greater than your protection. And the legal process took a long time. Longer than I had expected and more exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with court dates or documentation. The exhaustion was relational. It was the exhaustion of holding a boundary while everyone around you applies steady, gentle, persistent pressure against it. It was phone calls from aunts I had not spoken to in years. It was a letter from my father that was equal parts apology and accusation, that acknowledged what had been done while simultaneously framing my response as the true wound the family had suffered. It was my sister months after her honeymoon sending a photograph of herself and her husband with a note that said she hoped we could find a way forward. And I held that photograph for a long time. I thought about what a way forward actually meant in a context like this. Whether it meant forgiveness or reconciliation or simply the cessation of formal proceedings. Whether it meant that I was supposed to rebuild a relationship on a foundation that had already shown me exactly how much weight it could bear before it gave way. Whether love in this family, in this dynamic, was something I could afford to re-enter without surrendering the clarity I had worked so hard to arrive at. And I did not respond to the photograph. I placed it in a drawer and left it there. Not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of honesty. Because I did not yet know what a way forward looked like, and I had spent enough of my life performing certainty I did not feel in order to make the people around me more comfortable with uncertainty that was not theirs to carry. What nobody tells you about a betrayal this size is that it does not arrive all at once. You think it does. In the beginning you believe that the collections notice was the revelation, that you received the information, processed the shock, and now you are simply living in the aftermath of a thing that has already fully happened. But that is not how it works. The betrayal keeps arriving. It arrives in small ordinary moments that have nothing to do with paperwork or legal proceedings. It arrives when you reach for the phone to call your mother about something small and then remember. It arrives at the grocery store when you see a brand of tea she always kept in the cabinet above the stove. It arrives in the specific silence of a Sunday afternoon when families are supposed to be somewhere together and you are instead alone with the knowledge of what your family actually is beneath the version of it you were raised to present to the world. And I had built my entire sense of home around people who had proven they would dismantle it if the occasion required. That is not a thought that visits you once and then leaves. It moves in. And I began to notice during that period how much of my personality had been constructed around being useful to that family. How many of my habits and instincts, the way I handled conflict, the way I managed my finances, the way I showed up for people even when it cost me, had been shaped by years of being the dependable one. I had worn that identity like something permanent, like a characteristic as innate as eye color or height. And now I was standing in the wreckage of it, realizing that the identity had never been entirely mine. It had been assigned to me. It had been cultivated in me quietly and consistently because it served a purpose for people who needed someone in the family to be that way. And that understanding did not come with anger. It came with something closer to exhaustion. A deep cellular tiredness that arrived not from the legal process or the confrontations or the sleepless nights, but from the sustained effort of finally seeing something clearly that I had been half seeing my entire life. And I started therapy during this period. Not because I was falling apart, though there were certainly moments when the distance between falling apart and holding together felt very narrow, but because I recognized that the questions I was sitting with were too large and too layered for me to navigate honestly on my own. I needed someone who had no stake in the outcome. Someone who would not flinch when I said the complicated things, who would not redirect me toward reconciliation before I had even fully processed the wound. And my therapist said something in one of our early sessions that stayed with me long after I left that room. She said that the people who are assigned the role of the stable one in a family system are often the last to receive stability themselves. That the function they serve, absorbing, accommodating, enduring, becomes so naturalized that the family stops asking whether that person is okay because their okayness has always been assumed. It is assumed the way the walls of a house are assumed. Nobody asks the walls how they are holding up until a crack appears. And I had been cracking for a long time before anyone noticed. The truth is, I had been cracking before I noticed. And there were small moments I began to revisit from earlier years, moments I had filed away under the category of family is complicated or nobody is perfect. The time my parents had asked me to co-sign something and I had done it without reading it as carefully as I should have because I trusted them, and trust in our family was expressed through the absence of scrutiny. The times my sister's needs had been treated as emergencies while my needs had been treated as preferences. The way certain conversations had always ended with me being the one who adjusted, who softened, who found a way to make peace with an outcome that had not actually been fair to me. And none of those moments were the betrayal. But they were the education that made the betrayal possible. They were the years of quiet instruction in what my role was and what it would always cost me, delivered so gently and so consistently that I had received the lesson without ever consciously sitting in the classroom. And understanding this did not make me hate my parents. That is perhaps the most difficult thing to communicate to someone who has not lived inside a complicated family. Love, that you can see someone's failures with complete clarity and still carry something tender for them. Still remember the way a specific laugh sounded, or the smell of a particular meal, or the feeling of being small and safe in a way that the adult version of you now knows was never as unconditional as it felt. You can hold the grief of the person they were to you as a child alongside the reality of what they chose to do to you as an adult. Both things live in the same body at the same time. They do not cancel each other out.